Hey, good morning, everybody out there in Facebook land and YouTube land, and everybody that's joining in, friends, family, journey folk, people who are investigating maybe for the first time what's going on here. And we are walking through the book of Mark, Mark's story about Jesus. It's one of the four stories called the Gospels. Gospel means good news. So these are good news stories: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we are in Mark, and we are in the second week of our walk through Mark. And this week has been all about five confrontations, the fifth one being today, between Jesus and the religious leaders, between Jesus and the people who represent God in Israel, the men of power. They're called the Pharisees and the scribes. Scribe is a lawyer in the law. It's like a super Pharisee. And as Jesus has made his way out into public ministry, he's bumping into these Pharisees who are vetting him for threat to the religious establishment. And make no mistake about it, when it comes to the religion of the Jesus is a threat. When it comes to religionists, Jesus is a threat. And so in these five confrontations this week, we've seen this growing hostility and tension between this religious group and Jesus, and it will come to really a head today in this fifth confrontation as we're in the third chapter of Mark, opening the third chapter, verses 1 through 6. And so this is a turning point in Mark's story. We've said previously that Mark is a rapid fire storyteller, and he's speaking primarily to a Roman mindset, and the Romans are the ones who are holding sway over most of the known world, and they have Israel also under their thumb, both militarily and politically. And so this is a turning point this early in Mark's story, in just the second chapter. This is a turning point in Mark's story when it comes to Jesus and how he chooses to do ministry, what he says while he's doing ministry, what he does in ministry. And the turning point comes today at the end of our short section, and we'll get there in just a second. Part one, which was yesterday, of what we call the Sabbath showdowns. The first showdown was yesterday. The Sabbath is that time of quote unquote rest that the religionists took the original command of God to literally rest and put all these strident regulations on what it meant to rest. And if you were caught not resting in the ways that were prescribed, it could be a capital offense. I mean capital. Capital means put to death. And so Jesus comes into his ministry and he starts doing things in this time where absolutely nothing could be done. And yesterday, what he was doing is he was walking through grain fields with his followers, with his disciples, and they were, according to the law, acting rightly. The original law of Moses, where they were plucking kernels of grain and eating them along the way. Well, in these expanded regulations, the plucking was unlawful. And so Jesus was asked, why did his disciples do this unlawful thing in this Sabbath, that's sundown Friday to sundown Saturday period of time? And Jesus said, well, you obviously, those who are supposed to know their Bible the best, you obviously have never read that David did the same thing when he went into the temple and ate some of the bread that was consecrated, that was called the showbread, that was freshly baked and to be offered only for God's presence. It was called the bread of the presence. And so that heightened these tensions between the religious leaders and Jesus in yesterday's discussion of the first Sabbath showdown. And today's Sabbath showdown, it's another Sabbath, it's in another synagogue, it's at a synagogue setting, and we'll see that this is sort of the tipping point that changes the story and moves it in an accelerated fashion towards the cross. And so in the second showdown, we see again that there's what's supposed to be a benefit, the Sabbath, as given by God literally after his 6 days of creation. He rested from his work. It was then a command given in the original 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 that you should observe the Sabbath. And we talked at length about the Sabbath yesterday and what it means to us. Suffice to say, for followers of Jesus, we need to have a Sabbath rest also, and rest and prove our dependence on God, and show that we're not the ones who maintain all provision and activity so that everything that needs to be done can get done, and we trust only ourselves to make sure everything. Suffice to say, there's a lot that can be said on that subject. But the Sabbath was given as a benefit and not a burden. Well, what we see now in these two showdowns, and particularly in this one, that these expanded rules that were not biblical, that the religious leaders built in, was actually a burden. And Jesus' mission comes clear in the synagogue setting in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. This is literally worldviews at war. So for the Pharisees, what it meant to be right with God was to keep rules and regulations, therefore proving that you're good and therefore accepted by God. So it goes like this: I obey, therefore I'm accepted. Religion. And unfortunately, there's many members of Christian churches who still follow that personal mandate. God's going to accept me if I'm good and if I obey. Well, it's the exact opposite. It's right side up in life with Jesus. Life with Jesus goes like this: since I'm accepted, since I've accepted by faith his grace and mercy and forgiveness, I'm motivated to obey. Make no mistake, obedience is a requisite behavior of the Christian life, but not as a source and proof of acceptance. It is a source and proof of my acknowledgement that I'm already accepted, and out of devotion and love, recognizing Jesus' love for me, I obey because I know that's what's best for me. That obedience is the pathway to blessing for the believer, but it has nothing to do with acceptance. By faith, I'm accepted in the beloved. That's how the New Testament describes the church. I'm accepted in the beloved because of my faith in what Jesus has already accomplished, something I could never accomplish on my own. My obedience will not see my sin forgiven. Only Jesus' sacrifice will see my sin forgiven. And my faith that he has paid that price for my sin, and my faith in the fact that his resurrection proves my resurrection now, as he defeated sin and death when he came out of the tomb on Easter Sunday. And everybody said, so this is the two worldviews at work and at war. The religionist worldview, I obey, therefore I'm accepted. And the worldview of following Jesus, which is, since I'm accepted, I joyfully obey because I know there's freedom and security in his commands. They're always for my good. And so let's get right into this turning point in the story. Another time, 3:1, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And so we're seeing somebody who's deformed, somebody who either from birth or because of disease or accident atrophied. It's a man with a less than complete anatomy. A man with a shriveled hand was there. Verse 2, some of them, that's the Pharisees, this is a continued reference point throughout this story, were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Now that term, we're looking, it's a verb that means that they were scrutinizing carefully, closely, suspiciously. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Remember, these Sabbath violations could be a capital offense. Now, I've talked a lot about these expanded rules and regulations. I thought I would just pause here and give you a list of the categories that these religious leaders had taken the original benefit of the command to keep the Sabbath and now put amazing burdens and grinding obligations in the Sabbath. So I wrote down these. Where are they? Hold on, let me find them. Give me a second. I have them right here. I'm going to look because we have to do this. Somehow it got away from me. Give me a minute. Don't leave me yet. Here we go, right here. Ready? Here are the 39 categories, the expanded version. These are prohibitions, meaning you must not do on the Sabbath, sundown Friday, sundown Saturday. Carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, neither writing nor erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, selecting. And under every one of these categories is an exhaustive set of examples of what the category behavior might look like. Where was I? Selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing. Sorry about that. Spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, smoothing, or marking. So these were all the prohibitions. And so literally these religious leaders could fit almost anything Jesus did under one of these categories if he did anything on the Sabbath. And yesterday we saw his reaping that riled them when he and his disciples were plucking the heads of grain and eating them along the way. It was clearly an acceptable practice in the biblical mandate, but they had expanded it to be a violation. So now, back to our study. They were looking for a reason to accuse him. I'm still in verse 2. We'll get there. Asked him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with a shriveled hand, so we're in this congregational gathering. Stand up, he calls him out. So this is a guy who would have been embarrassed and hiding his deformity. Stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, and this is not a general ask, this is a specific glaze or glare at the religious leaders. He looked around, he asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? So what Jesus is actually asking is, when is it wrong to do right? He asked the question, but they remained silent. He looked around them waiting for an answer. And you see this repeatedly in Mark's narrative, in Mark's gospel, in Mark's story particularly, that Jesus is always watching for someone who is willing to courageously give the honest answer. He looked around them he looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed. Now this is an important word, and I want to spend a few minutes here. The word in the original language here is used for the only time. The only time this word is used in the Greek New Testament is in this particular event. The word is sulapeo. And what it means is, I am moved to grief by sympathy. This is the only time this word is used. It's called a hapax legomenon. You don't have to remember it. I like to say it. I paid for it. I ground my way through seminary along with my wife, who was the real hero of the story. So I paid for this stuff, and I freely give it to you. It's a hapax, which means it's the only time it appears. Sulapaleo, I am moved to grief by sympathy. I am moved to grief by sympathy. Or literally, I am moved to distress, or even this righteous indignation, because I am sympathizing. What I see often in my life is that I'm moved to distress by people who are hardened, but it's not really out of sympathy. It's just out of this self-righteous position that I take. He was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. The text literally says, by their hard hearts, by their non-supple hearts, by their impenetrable spirit when it came to evaluating honestly what Jesus had done. So, deeply distressed, moved to anger or grief or distress by sympathy at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. I hate to leave this section, because what I've recognized in my own life as a follower of Jesus now for low these many years, almost 30 years, is that Jesus has moved me to this sympathy and this grieving when I see people destroying themselves with hard hearts. It used to be back in the early day when I was a zealous, self-righteous crusader for the faith, that I would just look down on people and go, oh, you who don't know what's going on, you are going to be judged. But now at this point, I just get sad, because I recognize that a life outside the safety and the guardrails of life with Jesus, and the confidence that comes from knowing I'm completely secure in Him, and therefore orienting my life to His commands, any life outside of that construct is doomed to disaster. And I see that so often inside the church. And people that have been in church forever, who still either think they need to obey to be accepted, or they use God's grace as a license to move outside the moral guardrails and then destroy themselves or their family. And it just brings me to sympathy. I'm righteously indignant, I think, but it's motivated by sadness. And this is what we see in Jesus, and I love this. Even in His righteous, justified indignation, the catalyst and the fountain for that indignation is compassion and sympathy for those His hands for on the cross. Because He'll give His life for these very hard-hearted ones as well, for everybody. So He said to the man, stretch out your hand, which is literally Him telling the man with a withered hand to do what you can't do. Because he can't do this. He can't do this. And the verb here, as the miracle occurs, he stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. The verb is that he just cast it out like you would, like when you were throwing a frisbee. That there was no catching or no releasing of joints and tissue that had been bound up for decades. He just cast it out. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Now, did Jesus violate even the expanded Sabbath? Did you hear me read in all those categories, if you can remember? Healing? Did you hear the word speaking? Or speaking and healing together? Or healing by speaking together? They're not there. Jesus literally performed this completely restorative miracle from the words of His mouth. Stretch out your hand. So technically, He did not even violate their rigorous, burdensome set of regulations. But I would offer that the Pharisees might have. Verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And this expression, how they might kill, means utterly destroy. So in these 5 conflicts, which started in chapter 2 with the men who brought their paralyzed friend down through the roof, and there were observing Pharisees to begin their vetting process. In this short period of time, we've gone from vetting to conspiring to utterly destroy. And I would offer that this could have been a violation of their own, because we see this intricate development, this movement to join with the Herodians, to call a meeting with the Herodians immediately. The Herodians are the governmental figures. The Pharisees are the religious community, and the Herodians are the civil and governmental authorities. And they are strange bedfellows, because the religious leaders hate anything that has to do with Roman representation, governmentally or civilly. And even the Jews that were appointed by the Romans to be their representatives, it didn't matter that they were Jews. The religious leaders hated them. And the Herodians and governmental leaders thought that the religious community was an absolute pain in the neck, because they were always demanding to worship their one God. They were always demanding that their feast days and their ceremony days they be free to observe. And so they were literally on opposite sides of the line until it came to this common enemy of Jesus, who presented a threat here and a more of a nuisance here. And so I would offer that it's the very Pharisees who said that someone else was violating their rules, who were violating their own rules as they called this confab and began this process of conspiracy. So that takes us to this turning point. The decision of Jesus' enemies now to conspire to kill him constitutes this turning point in Mark's narrative and is a benchmark that affected Jesus' ministry from then on. And we'll see that as we continue next week through chapter 3 and on into Mark's story. So what do we do to gain some application from the collective of these five, and particularly now the tip of the spear, this one? The root here of all this difficulty and all this challenge for the religious leaders is the hardness of their heart. And that literally means that it's desensitized. The heart is dull, or the heart is fixed and can't be moved from its own presuppositions and decisions about how life should work. If you look at it in the physical world, an enlarged heart is a hardness of heart. The wall thickness of the heart gets harder and harder. The muscle gets dried out and rigid. And this is a spiritual condition as well. And this is what we see in these five individual conflict stories that then shows itself most powerfully, painfully, and tragically as the story reaches a turning point and the authorities begin to plan Jesus' death. How supple would you say your heart is? Are you open to honestly evaluate Jesus? And for those of you who follow Jesus, your hardness of heart could be in the fact that you're still convinced that you must obey to be accepted. If I were to say to you as a Christian, how do you know that you're secure beyond this brief life into the life that is most vivid to come? How would you know that that passage is a certainty from you? Are you confident? Are you certain that when you breathe your last in this brief natural space, that you will now experience the vivid promise that Jesus has offered? Are you certain? And if you respond with anything except, I'm definitely certain because of what Jesus has done. If you respond with, oh, I hope so. Oh, I hope I'm good enough. Oh, I hope I've done enough. Oh, I hope I've obeyed enough. Then you're still in the camp of self-righteousness, thinking there's something you can do. And if you're someone whose heart is convinced that since you said yes to Jesus at some point in the past, you're free to go live your life outside of the moral guardrails, and you're free to live a life of either not engaging his word or engaging it on a level that makes sense for you, you take Jesus on your terms, that you said you asked Jesus into your life. Well, the fact is Jesus will never be into my life. Jesus asked me into his life. And so if you're someone who has sort of a ticket to heaven stuck in your back pocket and you're out doing your own thing, you're in danger. Because it may be possible that your heart is hardened toward that true commitment of just allowing yourself to surrender to Jesus as your Lord. And when you do, you'll recognize after a time on the journey with him that his commands are not burdensome, but they're life-giving. When he says, this do, it's for your good and your freedom. Man, I'm learning that. I've learned that over the past 30 years. I'm still learning it at some levels. So one more application. When you are in relationship or network or come across someone who is obviously hard-hearted and you feel this sense of indignation as a result of sympathetic grief, knowing that the destruction that comes from hard-hearted thinking and behavior is going to destroy that person, or you just like to look down on them, like you just get angry and you have a self-righteous fire. And the fires of hell are going to consume you, and I can't wait to watch it. I think there's a real danger there. All of us are secure on the basis of God's grace alone through his Son, Jesus Christ. There is naught that I can do to secure my passage. Jesus has paid it all, and all to him I owe. And everybody said, all right, great week of study. Don't forget that we start this Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. We'll be streaming on these same channels. We'll be streaming our new series called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? Paul and I are going to team teach it. I have the first couple of weeks. So invite your friends. Everybody, bring them. Share our invite. It's out there on our Facebook page. Also, I want you to go right now and subscribe to our YouTube page, The Journey Bible Fellowship. YouTube, The Journey Bible Fellowship. Subscribe. We need to get 100 subscribers so we can have our own YouTube channel. And we want that because it makes it easier for people to access the content that we offer. So invite to this Sunday, 11 a.m., Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And subscribe to our YouTube channel. Let me pray for us. Father, thanks for a great week of study. Thanks for the proof that your Son is Lord of all. And today he's proven again in this showdown that he is the Lord. He's demonstrated that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. You created the Sabbath for our good and our benefit. And Jesus reminds us that it's always right to help and to heal and to do good. Father, please protect us from the heart of the Pharisees. Protect us from a hard heart. A heart that insists that we must obey to be accepted, or a heart that insists that now we've got a quote unquote ticket to heaven, we can go on about our merry way. And Father, break our hearts with sympathy and grief for those who are made in your image and are in rebellion at many and various levels. May we be moved first to compassion, and that our indignation springs from our desire to see your image bearers redeemed and restored by bowing a knee to the beautiful Savior, whose burden is light, whose yoke is easy, and who gives us rest. And all of God's people said together, amen. All right, look at 11 a.m. Central on Sunday. Peace.